Hey everyone, welcome to Reflections, the wisdom of Edgar Cayce. We're honored to be coming to you live courtesy of our broadcasting partner, moretalk.tv. And this week on the show, we're digging into the archives for an interview with Edgar Evans Cayce. Edgar Evans Cayce was, of course, the youngest son of Edgar and Gertrude Cayce. He was described by those who knew him as a Renaissance man for both his talents in academics and sports. He was an electrical engineer for 43 years. He was also known to be extremely fit and in excellent health well past his 90th birthday. Edgar Evans attributed his well-being to following the healthy diet and exercise regimen laid out in the Edgar Cayce readings. Even while in his early 90s, he mowed his own yard and played volleyball 3 days a week. Before his death in early 2013, he was a Trustee Emeritus of the A.R.E, as well as a devoted grandfather and golfer. He is also known as one of the A.R.E's authorities on Atlantis. His book, Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, explores the latest discoveries in the search for Atlantis, along with evidence of its destruction. He was frequently asked to describe what it was like having a psychic father like Edgar Cayce, and he said it felt like it wasn't any different from any other father. He described Edgar as being a loving husband and father, a great gardener, a very good carpenter, an enthusiastic fisherman, and of course someone who anybody could talk to. Hope you all enjoy our From the Archives with Edgar Evans Cayce.
Amanda, thank you. I feel like you've given a lecture. Maybe I ought to just give an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Amanda. I think I've got one of these. You know, psychic research and psychic phenomena, like a lot of things, it's easy to misunderstand them or misinterpret them. It kind of reminds me of the story of the woman in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, that lived not too far from Edgar Cayce. She'd never seen an elephant before. In fact, I don't think she'd been 50 miles from Hopkinsville. She probably never saw a picture of one. Well, anyway, a circus came to town, and one of the elephants escaped and wandered down the street and got into a backyard and got into a cabbage patch and started pulling up cabbages with his trunk and stuffing them in his mouth. And the woman heard the noise, and she went to the back window and looked out, and her eyes got real wide, and she knew there was a circus in town. She knew there wasn't anything like that around Hopkinsville. It must have come from the circus, so she called up the circus and said, "There's an enormous beast down here." Said, "He's pulling up cabbages with his tail." And the circus man said, "Pulling up cabbages with his tail? What's he doing with them?" And the woman says, "Oh, if I told you, you'd never believe me." So you have to be careful about misunderstanding and misinterpreting things. What I'd like to do this morning is tell you what kind of person Edgar Cayce was, what he was like in everyday life, where his psychic ability began, or how it began, the problems he had with it, what a reading was, and the different kinds of readings, discuss where Cayce got his information, how accurate it was, the factors affecting the accuracy of psychic information, Cayce in particular, and psychic information in general. This idea of the prophecies in the Cayce readings, and what's being done with the data he left. And finally, if you're still here, a question and answer period. If anybody wants to ask questions, just remember that it's not Edgar Cayce answering the questions. So I probably knew Edgar Cayce better than anyone living today. I have had readings myself. I've watched the readings he gave for other people. I was born in the family in 1918 and knew him until his death in 1945. That's a close association of about 27 years. My last memories of him, he was a tall man, slightly over 6 feet. His once brown hair was thinning and gray. He wore glasses for reading. He liked people. He liked to talk to people. He had a lot of hobbies. He enjoyed fishing. At one of the houses, we lived at several houses in Virginia Beach. One of them, he built a little pier out into the lake behind it, and he had an inner tube that he made a little platform on and planted a little tree for shade, so he'd pull that out to the end of the pier, and he'd sit there and fish in the shade of that tree, catch perch and catfish. He was a very good carpenter. The first house we lived in Virginia Beach, that house is still standing on 35th Street. It's been changed a little bit. They put vinyl siding on it, and the office that he built on the second floor out over the driveway has now been closed in on the bottom, but the house is still there. He could fix a door or shelf or broken window, and he was just very handy with tools. He liked sports, his bowling. He once used to bowl the big pins, not the duck pins, the great big 10 pins, and he once bowled a 300 game. But he played golf. He wasn't a very good golfer. We had, when we first came to the beach, golf was a lot cheaper then than it is now. And we used to play quite a lot. And I did see him get an eagle once on a par 4 hole. That's a 2 on a par 4, which is a pretty good shot. But his scores were never that good. I think he liked board games, caroms and pachisi. He did play some bridge, but he said it was too easy to tell what the other person had in his hand. So he didn't. We didn't play a lot of bridge. He taught Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church. He was a very good Sunday school teacher. He said he had read the Bible once for every year of his life. And that's probably true because he could quote it as well as any preacher. And I think the things that he knew about the Bible would just amaze you. I think maybe that's why the readings are so full of these and thous and biblical language. It maybe seeped over into that. He was not without his faults. He couldn't handle money. It ran through his hands like sand from the beach. And we were often wondering where the next meal was coming from. Now, asleep, Edgar Cayce was a different person, seemingly able to tap a pool of limitless information. But since he only spent 20 to 40 minutes once or twice a day giving these so-called readings, about 90-95% of the time he was a very ordinary individual. Now, how he started giving readings, this was before my time. I can't testify to this. I can tell you the stories I've heard. He had some strange experiences when he was a child. I think when the first reading came about, he was working at a bookstore, I believe, a stationery store, and he lost his voice. He couldn't talk. And of course, he couldn't sell many books if he couldn't speak. And he'd tried all the doctors in town, and none of them seemed able to help him. And at that time, hypnotism was a kind of new fad. And there was a hypnotist in town, and somebody suggested, why don't you try hypnotism? Maybe this man can give you a post-hypnotic suggestion that you'll be able to talk when you wake up. Well, Dad was willing to try anything. He'd tried all the doctors and it hadn't helped him, and he wanted to get his voice back. So he tried it, and he was a very good subject. He would go under hypnosis or go to sleep right away. But under hypnosis, he could barely speak, and he wouldn't accept this post-hypnotic suggestion that he could talk when he woke up. But the hypnotist said, you know, you're such a good subject. Said, you won't accept this suggestion from me. Said, maybe you'll accept it from yourself. Maybe you can give yourself the suggestion to go to sleep, and it suggest to yourself that you'll be able to talk. Well, Dad tried that, and he went right to sleep. And under this self-hypnosis, he described his condition as a congestion to the throat muscles, and he says, we'll clear this up. And he got real red in the face, red in the throat. He coughed up a little blood and woke up, and he could talk. So I think the first so-called reading was on himself. That's the way I've heard it. The doctor, there was an MD there, Dr. Ketchum, observing this experiment, and he said, you know, if you can do something like this for yourself, maybe you could diagnose some of my patients. So Dad was willing to try it, and he tried diagnosing some of his patients, and he was very successful and became quite famous locally as a man who could diagnose things in his sleep. What a reading was. It wasn't anything mysterious. I watched a lot of them. He would simply lie down on a bed or a couch. If he had a tie on or a collar, he'd loosen his collar and tie, loosen his shoelaces just to get comfortable. He'd cross his hands over his stomach and just lay back and relax. Whoever was giving suggestion for the reading, usually my mother, would watch his eyelashes and eyelids, and when they would start to flutter a little bit, she would know that he was in this self-induced hypnotic state. And she would then give him the suggestion for the reading. The suggestion consisted of just giving the person's name and where he was at the time of the reading. It didn't make any difference. The person could be in the room, or he could be in California or Kalamazoo. All he had to know was the person's name and where he was at the time of the reading. And she would say, you will have before you the body of so-and-so who is at this address, and you will give the condition, describe the condition, and afterwards answer questions. If the man was in the room, he could ask the questions himself. If he wasn't, he would write them out ahead of time. Dad usually never read the letters of the request for readings. He just knew he had a reading for somebody at this time in the day. And Mother would read the questions, and he would answer them. Then she would say, now he'd say, we're through for the present when he got through. Sometimes it was earlier, sometimes it was later. And Mother would say, now perfectly normal, perfectly balanced, you'll wake up. And he would wake up. He didn't remember anything that he said in this state. It was taken down in shorthand and later typed up. And there are copies of most of these readings in the files upstairs in the library. They're now on a CD-ROM disc, so anybody with a computer, if you want a copy, you can get a CD-ROM disc and do your research at your heart's content. The problem arose, I think, in the early days. Here again, this was before my time, before I was born. But some people around Hopkinsville, when they would get a reading, before it was over, they'd ask him a question, no matter what the reading was on or who it was on. They'd say, well, now, who's going to win the ball game? Who's going to win this horse race? What's going to happen to the stock market or the commodities market? And Dad would answer, much to their profit. But the problem was, when he woke up, he'd have these terrible headaches. He'd be upset at the stomach. He wouldn't feel well. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what it was. And when he found out, he really got upset. He says, I'm through with this stuff. And he packed up his family and moved to Selma, Alabama, and opened a photographic studio, quit giving readings. As I was born in Selma, Alabama, as a matter of fact. And he was a very successful photographer. Didn't give any readings for several years. And the thing that changed him was an accident that happened to my brother, Hugh Lynn. He was a small child and dropped. He was 11 years older than I was, but I was pretty young when this happened. It could have happened before I was born. I say I don't remember this particular instance, but I've heard Hugh Lynn talk about it. He dropped a match in a partially filled can of flashlight powder, and it blew up in his face, and this burned his face and eyes terribly. And the doctor said, well, he'll never see again, and we want to take out one eye to save the other. And that's when Hugh Lynn said, Daddy, please give me a reading. Of course, Dad did. And he described what to do for it. One of the first uses of tannic acid for burns. About 2 weeks later, a kind of a scab, a scar came off his face, and he could see. He did wear glasses in later life, mostly for reading, but he could see fine the rest of his life. So that was a kind of turning point, I guess. Dad decided then that if that were, maybe he was supposed to do this kind of work, since he could be helpful to people, that maybe he should do it. So he started giving readings again. I guess the next big event in his life was around 23 or 24 when he had the first life reading. Up to this time, all of them had been physical diagnosis, that is, a diagnosis of an individual's physical condition. I think someone was interested in astrology and asked for a horoscope or an astrological reading as to what effect the stars had on his life. And Dad said, well, stars don't have as much effect on your life as your past lives. And he proceeded to tell the man who he was in his past life and how it affected him now. And when he woke up and heard what he had said, he was as dumbfounded as anyone else. He didn't know anything about reincarnation and karma. He didn't know whether reincarnation was contrary to his Bible teachings, or he was just upset. He always said if he ever gave a reading that hurt anyone, he'd never give another one. But he didn't, and the life readings proved to be as helpful. He then says some of them he thought were as helpful as the physical readings. So he continued to give them. I think this was about 23 or 24. It was shortly after that. It had always been Dad's dream in giving readings is to have a place where the treatments could be administered to people that needed them. You know, it was probably even worse then than it is now, but you don't get medical doctors to take advice of a psychic very well. They don't even like to take advice of osteopaths, much less psychics. So it was hard for a lot of people to get the treatments. And he always wondered if, or thought, or wished that he could get a hospital to where people could come and there could be a medical doctor there. And he had a friend who was a medical doctor, Dr. House, who was a lifelong friend and who was an MD. And when he finally ran into some money, a couple of stockbrokers, the Blumenthal's in New York, that financed the building of the hospital. That's a building up on the hill here. That was what it was built for, a hospital. And it operated as a hospital for 2 or 3 years. And it was full of patients. And a lot of people were helped there. And Dr. House was the chief medical officer there. And Dad was in his heyday. I think when the stock market crashed, that is in 29, the stockbrokers lost their money. They hadn't taken Dad's advice to get out. He told them to get out. There was going to be a change in the specie, go off the gold standard. And they wanted, I think the argument they had was that they wanted more readings for themselves, and he wanted to give the readings for the patients. Anyway, they had a difference of opinion. They withdrew their support, and the hospital folded. From then on, we had some mighty lean years. Dr. House died at the same time, just about that time. So he had 2 kind of traumatic events. He had his lifelong friend die. He had the hospital go under. And we had a hard time. The readings were few and far between. We moved from one house to another. And then things changed when Tom Shagru wrote the book, There's a River. And Dad became famous overnight. Tom Shagru was Hugh Lin's roommate in college. He had been down to the beach before when he came down to expose Edgar Cayce during Hugh Lin's college years, and he went away shaking his head, not knowing what to say about it. But Tom got a job after school with the American Magazine and Herald Tribune newspaper, and he was a very successful writer. And then he contracted a form of arthritis, which left him paralyzed from his neck down. He couldn't move his fingers, his feet, his body. He went from 180 pounds down to about 80. And the doctor said, well, I don't know what we can do for you. You got maybe a couple of months. You go somewhere and die, nothing we can do. So he came down to the beach. I helped carry Tom upstairs. He didn't weigh much then. Both of them got him upstairs pretty easy, and he wrote the book after he got well. He stayed there and lived in our house while he got the treatment. I think Tom really probably talked to Dad as much as anybody at that time. He got all the material for There's a River while he was there. And about that time, World War II came along. Hugh Lin and I got in the Army. I was overseas. Hugh Lin was overseas. The book became real popular, and people were calling up Dad in the middle of the night. My daughter's dying. My wife's dying. Please help her. Can't you give her a reading? Instead of giving 1 or 2 readings a day, which he normally did, he started giving 4, 5, 6, 8, 10. The readings backed up. He felt he just couldn't do it fast enough, and he had a breakdown and partial stroke. And he had a reading on himself. And the readings, there wasn't anybody there but Mother. Hugh Lin wasn't there, I wasn't there, nobody there that could slow him down, and Mother couldn't do anything with him. He determined to give those readings, and he did, continued to do it. And when he had this reading on himself, they just said that you're doing too much, you're trying to do too much, you've got to slow down. If you don't, it'll kill you. He didn't slow down, and it killed him. After the war, the A.R.E. members, they had dwindled quite a bit then. But the one thing, if you want to say a prophecy, I never considered Dad a prophet myself. I did hear him say one thing, though, in his waking state. He said that after he'd lost the hospital, he said, this building will never be a success at anything but what it was intended for. And the Navy had it during the war. The Shriners had it after the war. Some of the best business people at the beach. It was a nightclub. It was a motel. And nobody could make a nickel out of it. Ramada Inn was built down here. All the beach motels were built. Anybody that bought property or did anything, beach was thriving. It was growing. I mean, it went from, when we moved to the beach in 25, there weren't a half a dozen houses between 17th Street and Cape Henry. These hills were covered with grapes, with sand dunes. We used to go up there and pick grapes. That was another thing Dad did. He loved to make grape jelly. You'd go up there and pick them scupping-on grapes by the bushel. And he'd make grape jelly with them. But of all the successes at the beach, nobody could do anything with this building. They couldn't make any money. So they decided to sell it. And that was when the A.R.E. had to make a decision. I think they made the right one. Hewlin and I talked about it a lot. They had the chance to buy it back. And the A.R.E., the members then, they didn't have enough money to pay the interest on the note, much less any principal. But Hewlin and I said, well, let's see if it's going to work. And they bought it back. Things turned around. The membership increased. They paid off the loan. They built this library. It's been a success at what it was intended for. Of the life readings, they are, I said I'd tell you what kinds they were. They were mainly three different categories. Physical readings, that is a diagnosis of an individual's physical condition. Life reading, and a miscellaneous category. There were about 60% of the readings are physical readings. The majority of them are physical diagnosis. That's where the emphasis, I think, ought to be. About 20% of them are life readings, and about the other 20% miscellaneous. Well, where did Dad get this information? Where did it come from? Hewlin and I used to discuss this a lot. Of course, my field was electrical engineering, and his field was psychology, so we had some opposite-end discussions. But we finally agreed on enough points to write a book, This Outer Limits of Edgar Cayce's Power, and there's a chapter in it on the nature of psychic perception. And anybody that's interested in psychic information, I think you ought to read that chapter, if not the book. It tells about the sources of psychic information. That's one thing Hewlin used to do. He used to travel around the world and interview psychics and try to find people with psychic ability and, you know, see how good they were compared to Cayce and, you know, what kinds of psychic information and ability there were. I don't think he ever found anybody with the consistency of Dad over a long period of time. There are certainly people, there are people today with various forms of psychic ability. I think everybody has some. Most everybody dreams. A dream's a form of psychic ability. But I don't know of anyone that has the 14,000 reports with doctors' reports and patients' reports and that kind of evidence backing up their psychic information. Anyway, there are probably 4 sources. And I think what applied to Edgar Cayce probably applies to any psychic. One of them would be unconscious memory. That is, everything you've ever read or thought or heard is somewhere in your mind or in your unconscious. If, in fact, some doctor in Canada did some experiments with stimulating parts of the brain with electrical probes, and people would remember things they hadn't thought of since childhood that they'd forgotten. So everything you've ever read or heard or thought is somewhere in your brain, in your memory. So unconscious memory would be one source. Another would be telepathy. That is the communication of Dad's mind with the mind of another individual, either living or dead. Of course, in that case, well, if he were giving information, a reading on someone, if you could communicate with that person's subconscious mind, even though the person would not be conscious of what was wrong with him, all the reactions in the body are there. If you could get in touch with his subconscious mind, you could give a beautiful diagnosis of what the person's condition was. If you could get in touch with a doctor on that specialty, maybe you could give a good idea of a treatment. Of course, you would just know what that person knew. Now, I don't mean to imply that Cayce, people talk through Cayce. They claim there are readings where someone else has spoken through him, but in all my years of listening to readings and having readings, I never heard him talk in anything but his normal voice. Because he spoke in a normal voice, it was his voice, it wasn't somebody speaking through him. So the telepathy is, this telepathic communication is a second source. A third one would be clairvoyance. That is, seeing things at a distance. You could call it astral body travel. I can give you an example. I used to listen to readings, and as I said, all he had to know was the person's name, where he was at the time of the reading. And he had a reading on this man in New York. And Mother gave him a suggestion, you will have before you the body of so-and-so who is at this address in New York. And Dad lay there a minute and said, he's not here. Said he's on a bus coming across town. Said there's a lot of traffic. There was a traffic accident. There's a lot of traffic. The bus is late. He'll be here in a minute. We'll wait. He lay there for 15 minutes, didn't say a word. All of a sudden, he said, he's come in now. And he proceeded to give the reading. When he said he's come in now, he then got up, went in the other room, called the man on the phone. The man said, that's exactly right. I knew I was supposed to be in my apartment. I was on a bus on the way there, and the bus was late, and I just this minute walked in. Now, there's a beautiful piece of clairvoyance that I don't think anybody could have anticipated. So certainly, clairvoyance was one source. Well, another example of that would be, not every time, but sometimes before a reading or during a reading, he would say, what a beautiful rooster this man has in his yard. Or this fellow is arguing with his wife. Or there's been a car accident outside. Or there's a pretty apple tree in his yard. And, of course, always we would either call the person or write the person and say, were you arguing with your wife? Do you have an apple tree in the yard or a red rooster? And we never found him to be wrong in a case like that. Every time. Whether he was seeing it as you or I would see it if we were there, whether he could see through a person or into the ground, into the strata of earth and talk about geological formations, or whether he'd just see it as we would normally see it, I don't know. But that was certainly a source. All right, the fourth source, there's two ways of looking at it. This is where Hewlett and I used to argue. Some people think there's such a thing as the Akashic Records. That is, everything that happens makes a record in time and space. And if you could attune the mind to those records, you would have unlimited source of information. Another way of looking at it is to think that maybe the past and the present and the future all exist at once, and we are just conscious of the present. And if you could move somehow into one of those other, back in the past or into the future. An example of it would be this. Let me give you an example. Suppose this floor down here, it isn't really, but it's a flat floor. Suppose it extended forever. It's a two-dimensional floor. It's got length and width. And suppose there was a two-dimensional bug crawling in a sine wave or crawling in a straight line or crawling in some figure across this floor. We'll say the bug has a free will and he has a memory. He knows where he's been. He knows where he is. There's a bug right there. See that little thing? Anyway, he knows where he's been. He knows where he is. He knows nothing about what's happening up here. You're sitting up here. You're looking down on him. You see where he's been. You see where he is. You see everything that could possibly happen to him in the future. You can say, in effect, you're seeing his past, his present, and his future, and you're seeing it all at once. Now, that bug could never understand, since he doesn't know anything about height, how you could see his past and present and future. Now, you could say, if you continue to go the way you're going in this straight line or in this wave, tomorrow at 3:30 you'll be right there, and you'd be right. But as long as he's got a free will, he can decide, well, I'm going to take off up here, take off down there, and you'd be wrong. So, while the future exists in an infinite number of probabilities and possibilities, I don't think it's fixed. Dad always said it wasn't fixed. And that's why I don't think of Edgar Cayce as a prophet. Certainly some things may be more likely than others, but maybe his mind, and maybe this time and space is a fourth dimension. Maybe this time, if you think of you move a point and get one dimension, a line, right angles to itself. You move a line at right angles to itself, you get this plane we were talking about, where this little two-dimensional bug lives. If you move the plane at right angles to itself, you get a cube. That's the kind of world we live in. Now, if you could move this cube at right angles to itself, well, how do you do that? Suppose you moved it in time. You let it exist yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The past, the present, and the future. Maybe Dad's mind could move in time, go back into the past, see the present, see the future possibilities. Now, some of them may be more likely than others, but I don't think they're fixed. Let me give you some examples of, let me go over this other first, and then I'll go over the examples. How about the accuracy? What factors affect the accuracy? I think he used all four sources. I think any psychic might. He might, one or the other. And I think certain things direct these unconscious to one of these sources. I mean, if he were giving a reading on a buried treasure, he might get a hold of an old pirate that buried it, and the guy says, "Hell, I'm going to tell him where it is. I'll have fun with him. I'll tell him it's over here." So it depends on where he's getting his information. Cayce's physical condition affected it. I know for a fact that he didn't get as good a reading if he were ill, if he'd had the flu, or if he had a headache or stomach ache, as if he were perfectly healthy. So his physical condition did have an effect on some of the reading. A lot of them were shorter than others. Not all the readings were the same. In fact, in our book, we talk about that. We find some that we think were wrong, inaccurate. Some people think that's sacrilege, that they didn't have, all the readings weren't right. But there's maybe a reason for it. Cayce's mental and emotional condition. I think if he were upset, if he'd been arguing with mother or a friend or somebody, if he were upset about money, if he were worried about something happening or what had happened, I know we had some, he was in a very emotional state after the demise of the hospital. And when Uncle Tom, my uncle died, Tom House. Anyway, his mental and emotional condition, his physical condition. I think the attitudes, the thoughts, the ideals of the person who was requesting the reading, or the people in the room, or anybody involved in the reading. A lot of times somebody would ask for a reading for someone and the person didn't even know somebody had requested a reading for them. Maybe they were trying to, it was self-aggrandizement, I guess. The man wants to say, "Look what I did. I found you a source of help, and it was me that did it." This was somebody, he didn't even tell the person he was asking for a reading. So why was he getting this reading? If a mother has a child that's sick, the child wants to get well, the mother wants the child to get well, Edgar Cayce wants to help the child get well, there's an empathy between them. You got a good connection. You got a good purpose. You get a good reading. But somebody is looking for a gold mine or an oil well or something, I'll give you a percentage of it. What's their motive? They want to get rich. They're greedy. I mean, they want something for themselves. It's not a spiritual purpose, actually. So I think that these attitudes, ideals, purposes, and emotions of anyone involved in the room, in the reading, the thoughts of it, hasn't had an effect, or has an effect. Because there isn't any question, but some of the readings are better than others. Some of them are longer, more detailed. Some of them are short and brief. We found maybe 200 out of 14,000 some hundred that seemed to have been inaccurate. And I think there were probably reasons for that. One, I'll give you an example of one. One was a reading, and when he gave the reading, the woman was already dead. But the request for the reading, this was some of those that had been backed up for 2 or 3 weeks. The woman wrote a letter, somebody or a daughter wrote a letter for her, and at the time the letter was written, she was alive. And Mother held the letter in her hand when she was reading the request for the reading, and said, will you give a reading on this person? Now, whether he went back in time and focused on the person at the time the letter was written, at the time, I don't know. I'm not trying to make an excuse, but I said it could have happened. So those are the things that I think affected psychic information. Let me give you some quotes of, I said I don't think of him as a prophet, but here's some quotes from readings that I think it shows Cayce insisted the future wasn't fixed, so we could change it. Here was a reading, I put some of these in a book called Humor from the Psychic. Our association didn't like it, I guess. They quit publishing it, but I thought it was a good book. But anyway, there was a reading back there that says, this is June 22nd, 1942, said, can information be given me when my brother, who died in 1933, will return to Earth? And the answer was, that's his business, not yours. Here's one, said, is there any likelihood of bad health in March? He said, if you are looking for it, you can have it in February. If you want to skip March, skip it. You'll have it in June. If you want to skip June, don't have it at all this year. So here's one, is the prediction true that I will die suddenly at the age of 80 in Tibet? And the answer, if you go to Tibet and live to be 80, you may die there. This depends upon many, many, many circumstances. You will not die in Tibet unless you go there, and there's not much prospect of doing that now. So, will I ever get into the moving picture field, and if so, will I be successful? The answer was, will I ever get in the way of an automobile or go up in a balloon? This depends upon choices made by and through the opportunities sought. Here's another one. Approximately how much money may be made during the winter? And the answer was, how many eggs will a hen lay? This depends, to be sure, upon the activities of the individual, the manner in which the approach is made. Such questions are dependable. Approximately, you ought to make about $40 a day, not net. It's not surprising that many individuals wanted a glimpse of the future. To those cases said, in effect, the future was not fixed, and that man's free will can control future events, though he often phrased it more colorfully. Please discuss plan and operation to cover the next 2 years and guide me. We wouldn't cover 2 days. These will have to be worked out by self and not from here. For remember, what you do today reflects in what may happen tomorrow, and to be sure, bears fruit in its regular season. I'll give you a couple more, because I think this is an important point. That if the case is tried, what will the verdict be? What will a jury do? You might as well ask as to what an eagle or a serpent will do. Physical healing comes under the same cloud of doubt about future events. It says, how long before it will be normal? Dependent upon the applications and how the body applies itself and what accidents would or may happen to the body and how care is taken of the whole system. That's the same as to say, when will a fly be swatted and when will it miss being hit? Well, I think these kind of statements illustrate Cayce's view of the future, and I don't think he was a prophet. He did make some statements about the future. If you want to say this, now, back in the 30s, in the late 20s and early 30s, when the ideas of geology and archaeology were quite different than they are now. In fact, we cover this specifically in that book, Mysteries of Atlantis Revisited. He gave readings that said man had been in the earth millions of years instead of a few 100,000. Well, everybody knew that was ridiculous. It's been proven man hadn't been here over a couple 100,000 years. When he said man had been in North and South America 10 and 20,000 years ago, baloney. Everybody knows Indians haven't been in North America over 2,000 or 3,000 years. The poles had shifted. Poles shifted? Impossible. Poles never shifted. Now, that was before radiocarbon dating, before the discovery that the poles have shifted a number of times in the past. That we had radiocarbon dates in Pennsylvania, 17,500, California, 20,000, South America, 35,000. It's turning out that man has been in the places Cayce said he was at the time he said he was. Now, I don't know whether you call that prophecy or not. I think it's just verification of the readings archaeologically. But one other thing, Gail discovered this one, and it was in our book too. He talked about future earth changes. and some earthquakes in the eastern United States. Well, there wasn't any way of proving it. I hope it doesn't happen. He named some specific spots. In 1987, this was 50, 60 years after the reading was given, the American Association of Engineering Society wrote a pamphlet. They made a study of the fault zones in the eastern United States. You know, the biggest earthquake in the United States wasn't in California. It was in Missouri and Arkansas, right where Reelfoot Lake comes together there. It, of course, happened in the middle of 1800s, so it didn't affect a lot of people. It rang church bells in Boston 2,000 miles away, so it's a pretty severe quake, but it didn't... It really didn't do enough damage to make the local papers. There wasn't any local papers, there weren't any local people. But they made a study of the fault zones because of the energy distribution systems. That is, the oil and gas pipelines, the electrical transmission lines. They might be vulnerable, you know, are they good enough to stand an earthquake? Would they be vulnerable? Where ought you to be watching out for them? And, in fact, we got permission to publish the maps in the back of our book. You can look at them. The funny thing is, they're exactly the same areas that Cayce talked about 60 years ago. Charleston, South Carolina, New York, up in Missouri, in the middle of the country. Same fault zones. And of course, Cayce said there might be an earthquake there. These people said at the end of their article, they said that these fault zones exist, and said the likelihood, now this is not Cayce talking, this is the American Association of Engineering Societies in their pamphlet. They said the likelihood of a major quake in the eastern United States in the next 25 years is 100%. Now that's about a certainty. They don't know where it's going to happen, but they know where they think it might happen. And I hope they're wrong, and I hope Cayce is wrong. But, you know, there's a case of an agreement with him. He did also talk about the Nile River flowing westward into the Atlantic at one time. This was a long time ago. No way to prove that yet, one way or another. In 1987, when they took radar pictures, ground-penetrating radar pictures over the Sahara Desert from the space shuttle, showed that the course of the Nile was once west into the Atlantic, right at the bulge in Africa, right where Cayce said it was. And that's something proven years afterwards. That wasn't in the nature of a prophecy, it's just something he said. It turned out to be right. Well, just remember, if you consult psychic information, take anything that's said about the future with a large grain of salt. I think you can control it yourself. Groups can control it. What's being done with the data now? Well, they have made some progress in putting the readings from the library on a CD-ROM disk so that anybody with a computer with a CD-ROM drive can research them to their heart's content. A lot of people are interested in different phases. I know there's 17 board members. I'm on the board as a Trustee Emeritus. I think that means a unique trustee. That is, you can talk, but you can't vote. So anyway, study groups, the prayer groups, the lectures, conferences, various types of research. I really think the A.R.E. ought to have a research director. I think it ought to be first. Research is the first word in the title, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. The research comes before the enlightenment. Dad said that once, don't get the cart before the horse. And I've argued with the board about this, they don't see it that way. I think it ought to be a part of the operating budget. You can't go along operating saying that if anybody gives us a grant of money for research, well, we'll let them take a tax deduction and we'll give it to a medical institution or somebody else. I think it ought to be part of the operating budget. There ought to be so much set aside. I mean, this is up to you all now. You've got to support it. If you believe this, write the board. In fact, I gave Amanda a list of the names and addresses and telephone numbers of all the board members. I don't think it's any secret. I'm sure you can get a copy if you want to write them. And if you believe that that's true, well, write them. She got a list of them. Yeah, I think it ought to be so much money for archaeological research, medical research first, archaeological research. And if we had any money left over, we'd pay the light bill and keep the library open. But I think that's the way it ought to be. But why don't, it's time. I don't want to run over and run into y'all's lunchtime. I think I've talked enough. If you want to get up and stretch, any of you want to escape can escape. And then don't take a 5-minute stretch, take about a minute stretch or break, and then we'll have some questions and answers till about 5 or 10 minutes. And after that, Doug, I see, is here, and Gail is here. We'll be outside and autograph any books if anybody's interested in the Mysteries of Atlantis. It's the newest and the best book on Atlantis, in spite of the fact that I had a hand in writing it, but it's so. All right.
Would you like something to drink?
No, I'd just like to answer any. If nobody wants to stretch, I'll answer a question. Yes, sir.
Apparently a lot is known about starting earthquakes, but I wonder how much research has been done on interrupting or stopping them.
I don't know whether there's any way to interrupt them or stop them. Most earthquakes are due to where the fault zones come together, and the pressure, a lot of times these tectonic plates are moving, and they cause pressures that build up pressure, and they finally fracture and erupt. I don't know what you can do to stop it. I know people have done more research on where these fault zones are. I mean, they're pretty well established. I say the maps of them in the east are in the back of our book. Of course, there's some in California. That San Andreas Fault is a famous one, and there are others. Yes, sir.
What kind of research would you think ought to be focused on heavily by the A.R.E.?
All right, I think probably two, medical and archaeological. I know they have an idea of building a health clinic here. I think that's reinventing the wheel, frankly. There are health clinics all over the United States. I think we'd be more effective, and this is where I differ with a lot of people. Maybe I differ with you on it, but if you could support a medical organization, there's a lot of things in the readings we could try and see if they work. If you could get that tried in a clinic, I mean, finance the research of it. Not many clinics you go to and say, we got $100,000 here we'd like to give you, and they say, no, we don't want money. I don't think you're going to find too many people turning you down. But if you could finance research in it, get the report in a medical journal, that's been done a little bit. The Meridian Institute is doing some of that work. They've gotten some, Doug might like to address that, but they have gotten some reports in medical journals. They've gotten a little bit done, but that's a little bit. We ought to be doing more. It ought to be, it's come from grants that people have given. It hadn't been part of the operating budget of the A.R.E. I think it ought to be part of the operating budget. I think you'd do a lot more with financing research through clinics, getting the reports in medical journals, getting clinics using it. You'd help hundreds and thousands of people all over the country. You'd have the support of the medical profession instead of its opposition with saying, look at this organization down here. They got a couple of quack doctors that are helping. I mean, this is not me speaking. This is the medical profession. I know how they talk. And they've got crazy things going on down there. You're helping half a dozen people. You could be helping hundreds and thousands of people. You could get it in. You'd have the support of the medical profession, not the opposition. The archaeological research, I think, is important. Of course, I'm interested in archaeological research. Maybe other people isn't. But it could change history. I mean, if Cayce would write about Atlantis, he talked about a mythical country. It's supposedly a myth. Nobody believes in it. But there's a lot of evidence turning up. I mean, there's a Duke University research ship dredged up some granite, continental granite, from deep in the ocean. And it's not supposed to be any out there. They've found some sands that used to be above the water with diatoms, these little animals, little small microscopic animals that live in fresh water at the bottom of the ocean, under a mile of salt water. A ship that was dredging up cable pulled up some lava. There are two kinds of lava, crystalline and vitreous, one that hardens underwater, one that hardens in the air. This had hardened in the air. It was pulled up from water 2 miles deep, not far from the Azores, from a cable that had broken. I mean, it doesn't prove that Atlantis was there, but it's pretty good evidence that bottom of the ocean was above the surface in the past. And since lava decays in about 15,000 years, it would seem to indicate it's above the surface in the last 15,000 years. That's the kind of, does that answer your question?
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much, all right. Yes?
You may not have a vote, but since you're on the board, can't you put a proposal before the board to be presented?
I've been putting proposals before the board for, I've been on, I think, every board that's been in existence since it started. And the board has changed, and I've argued about it, and they, you know, they give lip service to it, but nobody's serious enough to put it in the operating budget. That's what it's got to do. I think they ought to have a director of research. You had a question, yes?
Yes, what about Edgar Cayce's statement that the study of the mind should be the great study of mankind? It seems to me like if you're talking about archaeological research and medical
when I said medical research, I meant physical and mental and.
Oh, you're including the mind then?
I'm including the mind. Yeah, I didn't mean to omit it, but I think of it. I think of archaeological and medical as two separate things, whereas the medical would include all the things he said in the physical readings about the mind, the body, the triune, the mind, body, spirit is one. A lot of people don't accept that as a fact yet. You know, it's all of it's physical. You know, the mind has a lot of effect on the physical and the spirit.
You're saying Mr. Cayce could study the mind, but I would suggest too, if anybody's really interested in what he's saying, to read the 254 readings. Have you read those?
Yes.
Those are the readings given on the organization itself during the time Mr. Cayce was alive. And they're extremely interesting in that, again...
Talk a little loud. I don't know whether they can hear you. Now, what Gail was saying is there was a group of readings, a 254 series of readings given for the work of the organization.
Right.
And if you're interested in what the work ought to be, read those.
People ask him questions, and again, he slaps them on the face very hard, saying, you know, your name is Association for Research and Enlightenment. He says you got too much enlightenment and not enough research. And he says you got the cart before the horse. He says until you do the research, you're never going to have enlightenment.
I told the board, I said, if you don't want to put research in it,
on the ground. He's got to do the research, and the research will definitely produce the enlightenment. The majority of this material, 63% of it is on physical beings.
That's right.
And there are at least 3 to 4 different areas, proposals that you could give if you have the money. You would get the backing from Duke, from wherever, to do 2 to 3 or 4 different things, be it psoriasis, be it epilepsy, be it whatever. There are certain things that you could study. Cold spot fear, you know that one. Mr. Douglas, Richard can tell you, yeah, so over here can tell you about that. And it's, there's no reason not to do it. The thing is, we're not doing it. At least this organization, I'm not a part of it right now. This organization is not doing it. It needs to.
Well,
I have a very good doctor over here, too, that would agree with you on this, too. I think Dr. McGarrett. Glad.
There's been, I don't say there's never been any medical research done. There's been some done, but it could be done on a better scale. I think the board could support it with operating budget money. I mean, part of the, not just gifts. Gail, just a second. All right.
If you can get it in, like Doug has done, into your medical journals,
right,
suddenly they'll, redo it again, or they'll, again, try to do it. They'll, like you said, approach thousands and thousands and thousands of people to study just what you said.
All right. Yeah, I've told the board this. If they don't want to make research important, why don't they take it out of the title and call it the Happy Feeling Society or something? I mean, don't do this. I tell you, it's almost 12 o'clock, and I'll give one more question, and then we...
If I understand you right, you're saying that I agree with you, and I loved your article a couple of years ago, first time I ever heard that. But you would give the money not just to the Meridian Institute, but all over?
I would give it anywhere they're willing to do research, and depending on the amount of money we had. I mean, we'd give it to Meridian because that's all the money they had. They had about $35,000, I think, over the last 2 or 3 years that they've given, and that's probably gross over 3 years, not per year. I don't know. Doug can tell you more about that. Don't ask him. But they have given a little bit, but it's been what I consider a pittance. It doesn't look like the emphasis is there. It's not part of the operating budget money. It's money somebody gave as a gift. Yeah.
Do you consider that we participated in archaeology in terms of our support of Egyptian studies?
Of what?
Of the Egyptian scene.
Of what's been done in Egypt already. I think so. Yes, they've there's two sources. We got to stop. It's getting close to lunchtime, and I know you all are tired. Thank you a lot.